Lexa and I, we had some premarital counseling sessions. Her and I, we were having trouble with communication. And so we brought that up in the premarital counseling, and I remember being just really frustrated. I feel like she's overreacting, all this stuff. I communicate like this with my brother, and he responds perfectly well. This is how we communicate with my family. The pastor was like, aha, there you go. That is the problem. Your wife is not your brother. Hey everybody, it's me again. This is the Nice Veins Bro podcast, the number one podcast for nurses who want to live that next level life. I am Nene Pablo, host of this podcast, registered nurse, and creator of Nice Veins Bro. Every once in a while, I go back to my old nursing school and I help the senior nursing students to get a little bit of they do a mock interview, essentially, which I never got that, and I'm a little bit jealous of it because that would have been super helpful. But they basically get all of the senior nursing students, they gather them around, and then we have a bunch of professionals that go back and interview with them. And so I go back and I help because I think it's very beneficial for them. So as I'm doing my interview with them, or as I'm pretending to be some kind of employer, a lot of times I'll ask different questions that I think they will face whenever they go out to the real world. Questions that were asked of me whenever I went to the real world. I think it's awesome. And one of the questions that I ask a lot, because I think that it's pretty common for people to get asked this, is this question. Tell me about a time where you had to face some sort of miscommunication with a coworker or a employer or previous employer or something like that, and then how you dealt with that miscommunication. Miscommunication is so common. People want to know how you deal with miscommunication because it's something that you are going to face at some point in your life, and you got to know how to handle it, right? Communication is super critical in every single matter in life. From your relationship with your spouse, to your friends, to your coworkers, to your employers, whatever it may be. Now, I have a go-to story if I'm ever asked that in the future. In my first year of nursing, the techs would come around and get all the blood sugars, and then they would put it up on either the whiteboard or up on, the glass of the patient's room or door, so that whenever the nurse would come in, they would see the blood sugar and they would treat it whenever their insulin was due. Now, mind you, this was before we had updated all of the blood sugar machines, and so it would take hours, literal hours, for the result to come back and then transfer over to the computer into the EMR, so that whenever you're giving the insulin, you could see what the blood sugar had read. So this is before we had updated all the machines. And again, it would take hours. So I was taught during orientation, just take the number that you see on the board because the tech put it up on the board, and then treat the blood sugar. But this time around, I go in there and I take the number that's on the board and I treat the patient based on the number that's on the board, like I was taught and like every other nurse was doing at the time. But then when I looked at the results from the actual blood sugar machine, the blood sugar of the patient was 100. I mean, it was off by 100. I think it was lower by 100 than what the tech had put on the board. So I recorded it. Nothing happened to the patient, thank God. But I recorded it and I talked to people. I filled out the mistake form and all this stuff because there was a miscommunication between what the tech had found and what, was the reality. What really bothered me about it was that whenever the tech was confronted about this situation, she blamed it on the fact that she had told me verbally and she didn't write it on the board, and that the one in the board was from another result. But whenever we looked at the previous results, none of them had that number. So it was definitely a mistake on her part. I'm not pointing any fingers, but it bothered me that there was that miscommunication. And miscommunication, the point is, can cost lives when you're talking about healthcare. And even when you're not talking about healthcare, miscommunication can break relationships. It can be very, very icky and sticky when you're having to deal with everyday life, even outside of nursing and healthcare. The way we interact with our words matters. There's a quote that Tony Robbins has that says, "The way we communicate with others and with ourselves ultimately determines the quality of our lives." So the way we interact with our words and with our actions, with the way that we communicate, it matters. And that's Tony Robbins. I mean, scripture says it too. Proverbs 15 verse 4 says, "The soothing tongue is a tree of life, but a perverse tongue crushes the spirit." Can you imagine that? What we say can either be fruitful for others or it can actually crush their spirit. I mean, words are powerful. And then Matthew says that everyone will have to give an account in the day of judgment for every word that they use. That's Matthew 12 verse 36. So obviously, communication is important. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about improving our communication because as a result, it will improve our quality of life. Hola mi gente, everybody has a crazy nursing story to tell. If you want to share yours with the world, send it to me. I'll feature it here on the podcast and you can get my take on it. You can also ask me questions. Love questions. Remember, HIPAA rules do apply when you're telling your story, of course, and I will make sure you remain anonymous. I don't know what you're waiting for. Send me a message, niceveinsbro.com/podcast. That's again, niceveinsbro.com/podcast. Looking forward to it. Okay, so when you look up communication tips, there are lots of great things that come up online, but I gathered some that I think are going to be super helpful. And number one, I'm just going to go right through them. There's six things that I think that if we start practicing and we start doing in our lives, our life will change. Our communication is going to improve dramatically, and our relationships, both in and out of work, are going to be so much improved. It's going to be amazing. You're going to wonder why this is not something that you started implementing earlier. So the first thing is active listening. And that is correct, folks. That is correct. Listening is communicating. Active listening is communicating. When you are intently looking at someone, nodding with your head and grasping everything that they are saying out of their mouths, or even without saying anything, if you are intently sitting with someone, actively listening, actively engaged, that is communicating so much to that individual. So I would say the very first thing when we're talking about communicating is not even using our freaking words. It's listening. Listening is communication. Asking questions is the second thing that I want to say that will help our communication. When we ask questions to clarify, when we repeat and say things in our own words as to what they were saying, to make sure that we are understanding and grasping fully what they're trying to say. The third thing would be to then practice a response that is clear, that is concise, it doesn't get too wordy and messy. Sometimes we try to use big words that will try to impress the other. I know sometimes I do that. Sometimes I talk so much where I try to think in my head, how am I going to respond to this person in a way that is really good or whatever? And, first of all, we're not listening. Second of all, our response is only trying to impress or to try to make our point come across in a way that impresses the person. Use clear and concise wordage. When we're doing like lifestyle changes kind of teaching to patients, a lot of times that is the most important work that we do as nurses, and we kind of leave it in the back burner. The communication that we use when we're talking to patients or we're talking to families or to people in general in our life, if we were to just simply use simple, more concise, clear wordage, stay within definitions, Don't create brand new definitions and try to leave that to philosophers. There is a time and place for that. But when you're trying to put a point across and you're communicating with someone in daily life, right, from day to day, make sure that you're being clear, concise. This is not English composition. You're trying to get a certain word count or use double space and make it more complicated and use all these different words, say the same thing 5 times in different ways to try to get a word count. Like, it's not real. Stop. We're not writing a paper. We're talking to each other. And the point is to get a certain point as clearly as possible from point A to point B. And then as you do that as well, say it in a tone that is respectful, that is in a manner where the person is able to receive what you're saying and not be feeling like you're either threatening them or feeling like you're not engaged in the conversation, like you don't care about them, because your tone matters. The way that you talk, you could be saying the truth about something, but if you say it in a way that, people can't receive it, then what's the point of saying anything? Seriously, think about that. If you're trying to make a point, why say it in a way that people cannot receive it with your tone or with the way that you look? You can be confident with your words. You can say it con pepita, como dicen en español. You can say it con pepita. You can say it con, like confident and sure about yourself without coming across like an absolute a-hole. Forgive me. I didn't. Listen, it is possible. I promise you, it's possible to say something with full confidence and being sure of yourself and still not come across like a butthole. Like, there's absolutely a way of doing it. Sometimes it takes a little practice, but there is a way of saying it. Be respectful, use a respectful tone and a respectful manner. Body language is another thing. I think that it's like 70% of communication is actually body language. It's not even the words that you use. I don't have the study or where I got that information, but I'm pretty sure that about 70% of communicating is body language. Pay attention with what you're doing with your hands, with what you're doing with your eyes. Are you looking them, directly in the eye? Are you nodding? Are you not looking bored when they're talking? Are you focused? Sometimes it's better to just say, look, it's really hard for me to focus right now. Can we take a break or something? Sometimes I get really wordy when I'm talking to my wife, and then she'll very respectfully say, listen, I'm really having a hard time focusing right now because I'm hungry, I'm tired. And so she'll be like, can we take a break and then come back? And I much more appreciate than her kind of like plowing through it when I know that she's not going to receive what I'm trying to say. So sometimes it's better to like take a break and then come back to make sure that your body language is engaged to the person who's speaking. And then the last thing I wanted to say, number 6, is to be open to feedback and criticism and disagreement. Sometimes when we're communicating, we often feel like the other person has to agree with everything that we say, and we feel threatened when they critique us about the way that we're communicating or the way that, of what we say, or disagreeing with the point. The point of communication isn't to agree on everything, and it isn't to be absolutely perfect. It's to be able to say, it's to be able to translate a message as clear as possible from one individual to the next. So the same thoughts that are in my mind can somehow, in its purest form, make it to your mind. That is the whole point of communication. Okay, so what are the real applications? How do we bring it to a place where it's very practical, all of these things? How do we apply those things within our work environment? First of all, your employment has almost everything to do with the interviewing process, because you can have all of the qualifications on paper, your resume can be glowing, all this stuff, but if you suck at the interview, no one's going to want to hire you, even if you have all the qualifications. So the interview is probably the most important, and that's all communication. So within the first 30 seconds, right, is the first impression. So communicating is like the firm handshake, all that stuff. Like the application process has everything to do with the communication. So from the very beginning of a job or of work environment, it's about communication. So we got to get that straight. And then the reason why it's also very, very important to practice very good communication in this interview process, there are a lot of assumptions and a lot of expectations that need to be ironed out there in the moment. And one of the things that I wish that someone would have told me is that because there are so much assumptions and expectations, we have to then go back and rely to the communication and make sure that we iron all of that out. What am I saying? Have things in writing. There are so much assumptions and expectations, and it's so critical to get these ironed out that, earlier we talked about repeating, to see if you understand what they're saying. I would go even further and say that in the interview process, don't just repeat what they said to make sure that you get it correctly. Make sure that you have all of the expectations and all of your assumptions, the questions about assumptions that you have about what it's going to be like. Make sure you have all those questions answered and the expectations written in writing. Like, don't just repeat it and count on their word. Unfortunately, you can't do that nowadays. Make sure that it is in an email. Make sure that it's on paper. Make sure that it's in the contract. And sometimes that takes time. But I would say that, the more that you have in writing when it comes to an interview, that is a form of communication. And I would highly encourage people that if they're in the application process of some kind of job, the communication that counts is not just what you say with your words or what you say with your body language. The communication that counts in those settings is in writing. So I will say that about communication when it comes to application. And then another practical example to use really good communication would be whenever you're talking to doctors, whenever you're talking to a certain provider, when you're dealing with patients, you want to make sure that any provider who's putting in an order or something like that, that you understand not only what exactly it is, but why we're giving something. So that's why communication there is extremely important. For example, if a doctor says, give this and this amount, you've got to be very clear on the what and the reason why. And so repeating clearly what they're saying, like the closed communication, the closed loop communication. Hey, I want you to give this and this amount. And you say, all right, I've done this many times. You'll repeat it. You'll be like, okay, let me repeat that back to you so I know exactly what you said. And then you repeat it back to them. And a lot of times there's actually been times where I'll repeat something and it's slightly different when they said, and then they'll reiterate it. Or they'll think about it and they're like, actually, what I want to do is change it to this, because when you repeat it back to them, they'll reassess it as well. So there's a lot of benefits to this. But yeah, repeating the order or the stuff that they tell you to then implement with the patient is absolutely necessary. And it's definitely necessary whenever you're going to chart it. So make sure you're doing it in real life. Don't just chart it. Actually have that closed loop communication. Repeat it clearly, or just ask them to put it in. Okay, ask them to put it in. If they're asking you to put in an order, it's much better if you were to, because I've done that too. Some doctor will be running by and be like, hey, can you put this in? And then run by, and I'm in the middle of, for example, something going on in the patient's room and I don't have a paper or a pen, or I tend to forget things or whatever it is. I will literally just turn around and be like, actually, can you put that in, please? Straight up. Just because sometimes it's necessary for them to be the ones to put it in, because we may not have the time to make sure and repeat and have it clearly, put it in paper, whatever it is. It's always better for them to put it in anyway. Gosh. Doctors, put in your orders. Here's another one that's a practical example of areas where we really need to practice good communication. Bedside report. Y'all, bedside report is a nurse sitting there with you and just vomit information about the patient without you being able to repeating back. Now, it's not very practical for you to repeat back everything that they're saying, right? Like the closed loop communication. But that's where we start to see possibilities for mistakes. Like if they say something and you're going off their word, or what happens if you didn't receive it 100% the way that they said it, or you don't confirm with the repeat method. So a way that you can do that or work around that is to have the patient's information in front of you and to go through it together. Like if they're telling you, oh, this is what their order is, and how you titrate this one med, well, then pull that up on the freaking EMR and look at the actual order, and to make sure that you have good communication between what the nurse is telling you and what you're seeing in the orders. That's why sometimes it can take a little bit longer in report, but it is much safer to do that as opposed to, oh, just tell me everything and leave. Obviously, if it's a simpler case with the patient, there's a little bit more flexibility there. But if there's like important things that we don't want to be missing, it doesn't matter if the nurse is trying to run off and go home because they're tired. You've got to get a good, adequate report. So, the communication there is key. And if they're giving you terrible communication, you've got to give that feedback and be like, listen, can you go a little bit slower? I'm sorry. I'm writing stuff down. Can you go through this again? Can you go through respiratory again? Hey, can you go through skin? Because if they're rushing through it and they're not communicating it in a clear way, or if you ask a question and they're like, I don't know, look it up together, because the communication is going to save your butt in the long run. Something's going to happen. Whose fault is it at the end of the day? It could be theirs, but you don't want that to happen to you. So just ask the question. Ask the question. When we talk about emergencies, you know how they always tell us, we have to have clear roles, defining the roles and the expectations in the room while an emergency is happening. That is very, very important. If something needs to be done, you can say it out loud. You can ask a question out loud. A lot of times, the problem with communication is that no one actually speaks out in those particular situations. Right? There's a time for everything. In communication, there's a time to stay silent. There's a time to speak. There's a time to be more assertive. And it's going to take practice. It's going to take practice to know and to master the art of communication. At the end of the day, we don't actually learn everything perfectly. There's always going to be a way that you can communicate better, especially if you're working with such a diverse team. But, making sure that you are able to ask questions, that you feel comfortable enough to speaking up, is probably going to be one of the most useful tools when it comes to communicating within our profession of nursing. Listening is one of them. I think we don't do enough listening as nurses. And then, number two would be to speak out in those emergency situations, or when you don't understand something, to speak out and ask the question, hey, can I have some clarification on this? Communication is going to save your life. It's going to save your patient's life, but it's also going to save yours. So question, do you have any examples of poor communication, like a story of poor communication? Or do you have a story or examples about where we can use better communication in our profession? If you have one, feel free to comment below. I would love to hear your response and answer any questions you may have. So make sure that if you're watching this on YouTube, comment below. I love to get comments. Every time I get a comment, it's like I have a little party and I dance around in my room when I get my notification that someone commented in a video. It's a small thing, but it really does mean a lot when someone comments on a video. But if you have a story about communication, tell us, or an example about where we could improve. Hey, I just want to thank you for listening. It means the world to me, especially because at the time of this recording, I'm still only a couple months from starting this whole thing. So if you're interested in helping me build this brand even more, please share this podcast on your social media and grab some merch from the website at niceveinsbro.com. Got some great stuff there for sale. Send me a DM on Instagram and share some encouragement, some love, and some hate. I will welcome that too. But don't be shy. Talk to you soon. All right, to wrap this up, I want to tell you a story about my communication growth over the years, especially when it comes to marriage. Y'all, marriage is gonna expose all of the communication flaws that you have. Y'all, marriage will expose your communication flaws. That is something that I quickly learned. And we weren't even in marriage when I learned this, but Lexa and I, during premarital counseling, we had some premarital counseling sessions when we got engaged. And during that time, we were having some really difficult time communicating. Her and I, we were having trouble with communication. One of the things that would bother Alexa would be that whenever I communicated, I was very blunt, and I was kind of harsh. And so we brought that up in the premarital counseling, and I remember being just really frustrated. And the pastor was like, well, tell me a little bit more about your frustration. And I in my little spiel that I gave, I feel like she's overreacting, all this stuff. Whenever I say my feelings, I try to communicate very concisely, very clearly, and she's just like overreacting and always gets her feelings butthurt and all that stuff. And then I said this, well, I communicate like this with my brother and he responds perfectly well. This is how we communicate with my family. Like I communicate like this with my family and no one ever gets butthurt. So I don't understand why, if Lexa, who is going to be part of my family at some point, if she doesn't communicate, like if she doesn't receive it well, then, I'm not sure what to do. Like it's her problem. You know what I mean? I didn't say exactly like that, but that was kind of like how I was feeling. Okay. Have mercy on me. And the counselor or the pastor was like, aha, there you go. That is the problem. Your wife is not your brother. Your wife is not your brother. And she doesn't have the history of growing up together. Like she didn't have that background. She didn't have the privilege of growing up together and all of that stuff. So it's going to be a lot more fragile, that relationship, as it grows and as it grows and as you practice communicating. And he said that successful communication is not just getting something off of your chest the best way that you possibly can. It's also successful communication depends on if the other person is able to receive and understand what you are saying. That really changed my perspective because now, even if I want to say the same thing that I told my brother, like let's say I'm telling a story or I'm telling him how I feel, my opinion about something that's happening, I can say the same thing to Lexa, but I will say it like the way it comes out of my mouth is different because I know that the form in which I deliver that point that I'm trying to make, if I modify the format in which I say it, she will receive what I'm trying to say just as good as the way that I said it to my brother. But I'm not going to say it the exact same way because the way that they receive information is different. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. But what I want to just drive home is the fact that successful communication isn't just getting something off your chest. Successful communication also depends on if the person is able to receive it and understand what you're trying to say. I hope that you enjoyed that and got some kind of benefit from it. If you did, please share it with someone. The only way that we can build this brand and make it bigger and expand and share this kind of content with more people is if you share it. If you like and you subscribe on YouTube. If you're listening to this on a podcast platform, make sure and rate it, 5-star review, and also put in there why you enjoy the podcast. Remember to be a positive force within healthcare and society. Thank you so much for joining today. Que Dios me lo bendiga. When I would listen to podcasts before I became a podcaster myself, I didn't realize how much leaving a 5-star review helped. And so now on this side, I just want you to know that it really does mean a whole lot when people review and share the content. So if you enjoyed it, please share it with somebody and leave a 5-star review on whichever platform you use, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. And if you're interested, you can also find us on social media at Nice Veins Bro or shop online at niceveinsbro.com. My personal stuff you can find under Nene Pablo, which is spelled Nene Pablo. I spend most of my time on YouTube making vlogs and videos and on Instagram. So I would love to connect with you. And remember, be a positive force and influence within healthcare and society. It's all about God, wellness, and purpose here. Thank you for listening.